KW show, and we welcome you to our second show. We have another exciting show on tap. We're going to, of course, always talk about all the politics that are happening here around the country, and specifically we're focusing on conservatives and regrouping and refocusing the Republican Party in general. And our guest today is Jaime Miller. He's Florida Director with People Who Think. How are you doing today, Jaime?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Oh, we're wonderful. We appreciate you joining us by phone. I think you're up in Tallahassee right now, and
I am not. I'm in Sarasota.
You're in Sarasota.
Of course, session is going on in Tallahassee.
Yes.
I was up earlier in the week, but the Capitol is for the most part locked down. Not locked down, but it's you have to have a specific appointment to get in and move around, so you can get just about as much done these days over the phone. But I was up earlier in the week, so that was always a fun drive.
There's a lot of bills that are going through Tallahassee, and we're going to touch on some of those today.
Okay,
but, it's interesting. COVID's changed everything, so not as much access this year. But tell us a little bit about yourself, Jaime.
I've been involved in politics professionally since 1998, and by politics, I mean mostly campaigns. People Who Think, I'll get back to them a little bit, but we work with mostly conservative candidates and causes. One of our major political candidates is Americans for Prosperity. We did about 50 million pieces of mail for them in about 18 states in the 2020 election cycle. But we work with all types of candidates. In Florida, we are the media and mail consultant for Senator Joe Gruters, who is State Senator Joe Gruters, and he is also the Republican Party of Florida chairman. So I really got started probably like a lot of your listeners are getting involved now. Back in 92 and 94, just really did not like where the Clintons were headed with socialized medicine, and decided to get involved and decided to volunteer on a local county commission race, and in Sumter County, which some of your listeners may know, is in the area where the villages are now.
Okay.
Back then, it was a lot of cow pastures and very rural. And in fact, they had not elected a Republican since Reconstruction. And so in 1994, we won that county commission seat. A lady named Karen Krause, she went on to become supervisor for elections. And from there, I worked for the electric co-op through my 20s. I was married young, had 2 children young, and went back to college late, and graduated from college when I was 30. And so got involved professionally at that time in 1998, and worked for the Republican Party of Florida in Southwest Florida as on Jeb Bush's campaign, his first successful gubernatorial campaign. And then in 2000, I was director of field operations for the state party, and the subsequent recount, which was like a campaign on steroids, 37 days, 537 votes. So that we probably could have a show just about that.
Right.
And so throughout, after that, I kind of went out on my own and started my own consulting business, and worked with, a lot of the names that you've known throughout the years, including Jeb Bush and Rick Scott and Marco and other, just a lot of candidates, mostly in Florida. I've also run campaigns in North Carolina. I was the consultant of record in 2010 that helped the North Carolina GOP State House Caucus take the majority back for the first time since Reconstruction, with a guy named Tom Tillis, who is now the U.S. Senator there.
Yes.
And I've also run campaigns in West Virginia and Mississippi. So, and People Who Think, I've joined them 2 years ago, and we are a nationally ranked advertising firm. Business Inc. has us ranked as the 81st or so top 100 advertising firm in the country. We are kind of a large enough firm that we're not boutique, but we're still family owned. The the husband and wife who started us are still the CEO and COO. We have about 40 employees, and we work with a lot of the brands that your listeners know: Little Debbie Snack Cakes, Chevron, Tabasco, Moe's, Southwest Grill. Welcome to Moe's. We've worked with them. Mellow Mushroom. A lot of your listeners would be familiar with, or Painting with the Twist.
Yes,
That's
yes.
one of our clients. Rock and Roll Hall of Fame has been one of our clients. So, Blue Cross Blue Shield, we've worked with some, and we work with a lot of smaller firms. So we have 3 verticals in our advertising. We have innovative advertising, which is strictly an advertising and PR firm. We have a vertical that is called The Fridge, which is run out of Nashville. Our home base is in New Orleans, Louisiana. Our headquarters is in New Orleans, Louisiana. And then we have The Fridge out of Nashville, which is specific to restaurants, hospitality, and tourism. You can imagine in New Orleans, we have a lot of restaurant clients, local tourism clients. And then we have Innovative Politics, which is conservative candidates and causes. So you can go see us at People Who Think, and you can get to all 3 of those verticals and check it out if you're interested in. And we do everything from A to Z, but we also know that oftentimes we're a big enough firm that sometimes we're a big enough firm that sometimes small firms call us in to help out, and
Right.
we're also a small enough firm that sometimes big firms call us in to help out. So we tell people we can do as little or as much as they need us to do. We have everything we do is in-house. We have 2 high-definition post-editing TV bays that probably are we're probably the only firm our size, certainly in the Southeast, that has that type of technology in-house. We do our own digital buys, digital advertising, mail, just everything you can think of in the advertising
Jaime,
agency we do.
That's an incredible background, and I'm so anxious to talk to you. You have such a long history here in Florida. We're particularly going to be interested in the conservative side of politics. And folks that are joining us by Facebook Live, join the conversation. You can, write some comments. Good morning, Brian Jones, and appreciate those of you that are tuning in. But if you make a comment, we'll certainly have you join the show with your comments. So, Jaime, let's talk a little bit about what's going on in Tallahassee right now.
Sure.
There's some bills that are going through. One of them that I think is incredibly important is Senate Bill 90 about election administration. They're trying to tighten up the vote by mail ballots.
Mm-hmm.
And right now it's only a Senate bill. Republicans favor it. The Democrats oppose it. It prohibits the display of absent electors' party affiliation or other information on the outside of the ballots on the return envelopes. I know that was a huge issue this last election. Have you been following that bill at all, where have an idea where it's going to happen?
Yeah, I don't know the specifics of it. I know the generalities of a couple of bills that are floating around, our legislature as well as others. It's always interesting to me that Democrats stand against transparency. I mean, I'm an advocate that we should have a camera in every precinct. Anywhere someone is voting, we should have a live stream camera. Why shouldn't anyone in America be able to, click on precinct 3 in Sarasota County and see what's happening there? And, the fact that Democrats don't want any type of reasonable reforms is just shows where, their heart lies as far as wanting to have fair and transparent elections.
Absolutely, Jaime. And this last election really showed us a lot of weaknesses in our electoral system, especially in other states. So, everybody that can tighten up the election process and ensure voter integrity, every step towards that is
I think
needed.
the Senate Bill 90 is a bill. I think a lot of it is to stop people from ballot harvesting, which you're familiar of, is somebody, you have an absentee ballot, somebody comes and knocks on your door and says, hey, I'll return your ballot for you.
That's right.
And they collect the ballot, and they take multiple ballots of people who are not family members and deposit them in these mail drop centers. So we really don't know who touched the ballots, what happened to the ballots between the voter and the voting booth. Literally, the voting booth is the drop center. The voter's in their house. They handed the ballot over to a stranger, and we have no idea what happens with that ballot between the voter and the voting booth. And that has to stop. That has to stop everywhere.
It does.
And I'm glad to see that there's a bill in the Florida legislature that is handling that particular issue.
Absolutely, I agree tremendously. Brian Jones says Rick Scott is pushing amnesty now, tit for tat. He's saying so. Interesting comment. What do you think about that, KW?
Well, yeah, look, I mean, Jaime, you know my views on some of our senators' positions. At least we've shared a few. We can, I think, talk about kind of the future of, let's kind of talk it from the top down, right? The future of Florida politics from both a senatorial and a congressional level. And maybe this is a good segue to kind of let Jaime kind of get into with us, Casey. What is the future of Florida politics look like with redistricting coming up? That's kind of really the big question of the day.
Big question.
Right. And,
Everybody's following
Florida
that.
has 27 congressional districts right now. And we are, correct me if I'm wrong, we're slated to get at least 2 more seats, Jaime. Is that correct?
That is conventional wisdom for sure. Yes.
Okay. Now, I've heard rumor that we might get a third, but that's probably not likely. What is your take on that?
So the third congressional seat, it would cause a lot of political turmoil probably for the Biden administration. There's been some discussion.
I'm okay with that.
That the Biden administration would revisit the census because
Right.
they don't feel that it was done fairly, didn't count homeless people, didn't count, blah, 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 go down the Democrat talking points on that. And so the problem for Biden is that during COVID, so many people moved to places like Texas and Florida,
Right.
from states like Illinois, New York, and California, that some of those Democrat states would likely lose an additional, at least 1 congressional seat, if not 2, to states like Florida and Texas. And so we're already picking up 2. When the census was taken, we were, I think, just about 130,000 people short of a 3rd congressional seat.
Right.
So 130,000 people short is short. But if you revisit the census in any way and you try to redistribute any type of those numbers, you almost cannot do it without giving Florida that 3rd congressional seat. And so I don't think that happens, but that's up to the Biden administration. I forgot the second part of your question.
Well, I mean, that was the second part. Whether you think there's a possibility we could literally get a 3rd seat going into
Possible, but unlikely.
Okay, so then why don't we, for our listeners, Casey, let's let Jaime, because he really does have a really good insight in this. Why don't we let him walk us through how redistricting would work going into, I guess, 2022, Jaime, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
And so normally by this time, the U.S. Census Bureau would have already given states their numbers. There's been this controversy at the federal level between the transition of the Trump administration and the Biden administration. So the actual census blocks, so it's not just, you can't just go out and draw somebody's house. Everybody has a census block in which they live, and the people are counted in those blocks. And so the Census Bureau then distributes saying, hey, here's how many people live in these different blocks. And so, and your district, you don't just draw lines. The lines are these literally, little tiny blocks all over the map that you have to keep those blocks in whole. And so when you draw lines, so they, we'll talk about basically congressional because that's where most people want to talk. As a general rule, just to get it out of the way, the state house will draw the House district, the state Senate draws the Senate district, and they go through whatever legal process. And then on the congressional side, with the 2 new seats, it's because of increased population. So, there's several maps out in the world that are, people speculate, the Cook Report, Larry Sabato's crystal ball. There have not been any official maps from either branch of the legislature to suggest what maps may look like. Some are a little bit more of a conservative Republican map that would probably gain us 3 seats in the state of Florida. And I think the most aggressive map would probably have Republicans gaining 5 seats. But if you do that
would be amazing.
You can get 5 seats in 2022, but you probably lose 2 or 3 of them over the decade because of where the growth is, right? So where people are moving, where they're moving from and to. And so the more aggressive map today is probably a worse map long term. The more quote, conservative map, which gives us fewer seats today, is probably the more, quote, stable map as far as Republican versus Democrat representation in the state at the federal level for the next 10 years.
So, Jamie, you redistrict after every census because that's the
Yes.
population. Population depends how many seats you have. What happened a few years back? There was redistricting, if I remember, about 2015, maybe 2016, right here in Florida.
Yeah, I think it was after the 2014 election. So a court in Florida, or might have been a federal court, I forget which, said that the state Senate districts and the congressional districts were not legal because they were drawn to ensure racial representation. So they were drawn to ensure African American districts. And now that's one of the things that's different this census is that you had to get your maps in past decades. You had to get your maps, let's say the past 4 decades, not the past 200 years. But last 3 or 4 decades, Florida had to get their maps, quote, pre-qualified, meaning you have to have a certain amount of basically African-American representation. Well, that's been thrown out at the federal level, is my understanding. And so the state Senate and the U.S. House seats were redrawn, I believe, for the 2016 election due to that lawsuit. So it wasn't because of the census; it was because of a lawsuit. And a judge's decision.
Right. And I believe the League of Women Voters was heavily involved with that.
They were, yeah.
It was basically they accepted the League of Women Voters map over our elected officials' map. So people who were not elected to anything got to choose the map, which is, not something I agree with.
Right. I agree with you on that for sure.
Well, I have Jamie. Let's dive a little deeper into this because this is really, I think, this is basically probably deep, we got a lot of issues on the plate, but this is probably one of the most important for the state of Florida, in my opinion. Going into the 2022 election, which is our ability to, essentially hold the line in what we'll call, the moderate to conservative movement. Especially knowing that Florida and Texas, for lack of better terms, are under attack by the left. They're trying to swing us. Because we have so many between Florida and Texas, or not so many, but we have a lot of electoral votes, and we have a pretty fair amount of congressional districts. What's your take on? We're not asking you to give us the crystal ball, but let's get into it. Where's this going to be? What do you think this redistricting is going to look like? I mean, tell us your opinion.
A little bit of a tangent. So I'll get into what redistricting will look like. But we're under attack so much, and it happens on such a daily basis with what appears to be trivial things, and they are not. Little things like, we're going to change the hurricane season to May 15th.
Right.
Why would we do that when Florida has never been hit by a hurricane before June 12th? And that was like in 1954 is the earliest hurricane, and that was a Category 2 hurricane. And so we haven't had a hurricane, Category 3 hurricane hit Florida before July 1st. So why is that? Why do they want to change those types of things? Well, it helps with, this global warming is happening or climate change is happening. I believe it's retribution from people from California who want to hurt Florida's tourism season, the summer tourism season. I mean, I think we're under attack every day by little tiny things. Like I said, it was a tangent, so thank you for letting me get that out of my system.
You got it.
So if you look at the census and where the population growth is, the 2 congressional seats would fall somewhere outside of Orlando, and depending on who you talk to, you could talk about the villages up to the northwest or Osceola County to the south. But and you probably talk about that swath through Polk County to Osceola is where truly the population growth grew enough to create a new congressional seat. And the other congressional seat would likely be in Southwest Florida, north of Naples. And so now every time you touch somebody's lines, it moves lines, right? So
can impact.
And at the end of the day, your map has to be, you have to have the same population in each congressional seat. And so And that's why some of these census blocks are really small. Some of them have 8 or 10 people in them. You know, they might have acreage or whatever, but some of these census blocks are really small. If some of them, Miami-Dade, you might not have a census block with fewer than 5,000 people, you know. But a lot of them are you can spread these things out. So,
well can you get a little more specific north of Naples?
Where does the map go?
Yeah.
And, you know, I think there is some thought that you take Orange County and say, okay, Democrats now have Orange County, and you basically draw 3 Democrat districts inside of Orange County that kind of spindle out and pick up some Democrat areas in Seminole and Osceola counties, and you just make those 3 strong Democrat seats, and that's that. And then you create maybe 1 or even 2 additional Republican seats out of that, or you make 1 red seat and 1 purple seat. You know, you have the 3 dark blue seats, and then you make 1 red and 1 and change 1 of the blue ones to purple.
Jaime, is there a committee that is looking at redistricting, or that draws the lines and then it goes to the Senate and the House, or, you know,
The House and Senate draw on the congressional map. Literally, the House and Senate can draw their own maps and present them to each other and then discuss it like they do the budget.
Is there a core group of people, though, that present it, you know, like that goes through committees like bills, or?
It will. I mean, it will, but it's, yes. The short answer is yes. Okay. There is a public process for input, and that it will get, you know, that gets public scrutiny, public comment, and public votes by legislators. But it is legislators in both the House and Senate that will draw the congressional maps.
Okay.
And who makes the final decision and when they come to a gridlock, which is probably inevitable here, potentially?
You know, you have a joint committee.
Right.
The joint committee just has, if they come to a gridlock, then the courts, that's the easiest lawsuit for somebody like the League of Democratic Women to file lawsuits. You know, so I mean League of Women Voters. Excuse me.
We caught that.
So that's then. You know, if the legislature fails to present a map, then it is up to the court to create the map.
Is that the Florida Supreme Court, basically? Is that where it goes?
That's where it's inevitably going to end up.
Right.
I mean,
okay.
I think that's just where it ends up anyway.
Yeah.
Got a question off Facebook for you. I've been a precinct committee man. I know that the precincts can be so big, the committee man cannot really cover the areas. How can more committee men or women be added, and what is the process for that?
So we're talking about in a Republican executive committee?
Yes.
So it depends on your county structure. So you can have, for instance, I believe in Sarasota County, we have the precinct structure, but we also have a district structure. And so you can elect a certain number of people to, by party rule, is my understanding. It's been a long time since I've really dealt with party rules, even though I was executive director. But it's, you know, those rules get changed and the state statutes get changed on that. So I do know there's several large counties that elect, instead of from individual precincts, they elect from districts. So they combine precincts, and so let's say they combine 5 precincts. You're allowed to have 10 or 15 or however many in that precinct, or in those precincts, and they just say, oh, here's a district, because one precinct might not have anybody, and the other precinct may have, you know, a lot of volunteers. There may be a retirement community where a lot of people want to volunteer, and so I would suggest to your listener to read the party constitution, and I think you can find that at the Republican Party of Florida's site, rpof.org, and I think there's a link there to what would be called the county model constitution.
Okay.
And I think those, or there's also a document there called the rules of procedure, but I think you would find that in your county model constitution.
That's a good question. Thank you, Brian. You know, it's going to be very interesting to watch the redistricting because, as
Yeah.
you were saying, it impacts all the other districts because they have to redraw the lines of the other ones to put these two in. So there could be impacts here in southeast Florida as well, even if the district doesn't end up being a new one here.
Well, isn't
There
that?
is,
Go ahead.
there's a real chance that there's inevitably it's going to impact Southeast Florida.
Yeah.
Just even if it doesn't create a new district, you've had enough population growth in pockets,
That's
you know,
right.
especially out west for you guys, out for out away from the Atlantic, that that these district lines have to change to encapsulate that population. So
They're gonna have to
we're
carve
going
off,
to see
yeah.
these lines change regardless of whether there's, quote, a new district in Southeast Florida.
Well, that's something we've been talking about, which is slivers of districts will be carved off, Jamie, it's in some form, to essentially not only encapsulate these new districts, but to kind of reaggregate or recongregate other districts where you could argue that the population has grown. So the magic question is, when is this going to be released? Okay, not so much. Well, let's talk about it. But we have the federal census data that's coming out of now a fundamentally liberal leftist regime out of Washington. Okay, let's call it what it is. But then it has to get into the state of Florida and go through the state of Florida's process. And then you have to basically get people wired up for the 2022 primary election. So walk us through when this is going to happen, Jamie, because people want to know how to prepare for this.
My understanding is that the census data is going to run through whatever federal process it has to by let's call it Labor Day, which would make sense. Remember, even though Florida's legislative session is March and April this year, it is January and February next year.
Ah, okay.
So it's a little bit quicker. And so committee weeks start a little earlier because there's not a November election statewide. And so those committee weeks will start shortly after Labor Day. And I expect you'll start seeing some level of maps that are public and being discussed probably as early as Labor Day.
So, Jamie, this is going to be a little interesting for candidates, is it not? Because we're not going to have these final districts to see, who's going to run and where.
It is.
Until the session.
It's, those are going to be, when you start talking about a competitive congressional district, especially if you have an open seat and you have primaries, you are talking about a multi-million-dollar effort for the primary and a multi-million-dollar effort for the general in most cases. And I would think in most of Florida's media markets, congressional districts, that would be the case just because of the television that would be involved.
So there would be obviously two new seats. You'd have not to use the word free-for-all, but there'd be a massively competitive effort on all sides for those two seats. But really, the wild card besides that, Casey and Jamie, is how much of current congressional districts get carved off so that when people are declaring for the primary on existing districts, okay, they don't really know what those districts are going to look like as they stand today, the existing districts. Now, Jamie, what's your thought on that? Because doesn't that create a little bit of a wild card?
Let's take Southwest Florida, for instance.
I mean, that's my question.
Because I think it's a little bit easier to discuss. Maybe your listeners aren't as familiar. So you basically have Naples, Fort Myers, Punta Gorda, which is a small city in Charlotte County, Sarasota and Bradenton. So you have those cities in 5 counties along the Southwest Florida coast. And so if you plop a new congressional district in, Bonita Springs between Naples and Fort Myers, which is where the population growth is, you probably push all of these districts north. So if you take the most northern seat, which is Vern Buchanan, and his seat is already into Hillsborough, the county that Tampa resides, into his seat already goes into southeast Hillsborough County. So his seat could come out of Sarasota County. I'm in central Sarasota County, and he's my congressman. So he maybe would go north, maybe even north of me. Greg Stubbe would maybe go north and maybe a little bit farther out east towards Highlands County. And then you would stretch these districts north, right? So Vern could end up in a situation I think, I think he's the example because he's on the outer edge where he loses, 30 or 40% of his quote incumbency, voters who have been voting for him for 14 years,
right,
and push him into, Tampa, South Tampa, where people really haven't known him at all. And so, so therein lies kind of, and then who knows, let's say somebody decides from Tampa decides the primary burn. Well, then you have, this turmoil that could come out of all of that. I mean, I certainly hope that doesn't happen, but, you and I have a differing opinion on some of that.
right. Well, the question is, right, but so isn't there two pieces in play here? And I want everybody to understand, because this is why I'm going at this question. We obviously have two new seats we think locked in. We don't know exactly where they're going to be districted, but they're coming into Florida, southwest central Florida. But before that, and that'll be after. Well, that would be declared March of 2022, Jamie, just to give an idea, or April. When would those seats kind of, in your opinion, be?
They'll be solidified as far as people running for them by the end of session, which will be February.
Okay, so call it March 1. The lines would be drawn, and we would know who's putting their name in the hat for those two new seats. But before that, typically, candidates don't wait until March of the year of the primary to put their name in the hat for congressional seats. So you got some political jockeying.
Anthony Sabatini, the state representative there, believes there's going to be a new district where he can run. Your problem is that you have to file for a district, and the district he's filed for is against Congressman Dan Webster. And so you have to kind of take your lumps, which, that in and of itself is going to hurt his fundraising effort.
Right.
I believe. I mean, Dan Webster's has been a pretty stalwart conservative for 30 years.
Well, that's the point. See, voters and listeners need to understand that this is kind of a, roll the dice a little bit model on the conservative side, because you may have to basically declare in a district today, as it currently sits, that you're going to be primarying on paper another theoretical conservative or Republican, where normally, the wisdom would say don't do that.
Right.
Because you don't know where the line's going to be.
Example, and you take someone who lives in Kathy Castor's district and it's a Democrat, and you even if you're a conservative Republican thinking the district will grow into, and you're not running against Kathy Castor, you're announcing a run, but you're not going to be able to raise money running against Kathy Castor even.
So that takes us to the question I think Casey started initially, or was talking to you about, because I think there's going to be an additional wild card put into this by the fact that Marco Rubio is up for election in 2022, and we're starting to see, at least on paper, some jockeying for potential candidates. Now, what about the likelihood that some congressional representatives today put their name in the hat for Marco Rubio's seat, and that also throws a further wild card into the congressional run? Doesn't change the redistricting model, but it changed who the candidates might be running for that district. I think we talked about Stephanie Murphy.
Yes. Okay. So, yes. I mean, there's some discussion that Stephanie Murphy would run. There's some questions that Val Demings would run. Those both Democrats from the Orlando area, and that changes the dynamic, I guess, a little bit from redistricting, in the fact that you no longer have a Democrat incumbent who is actively saying, hey, I'm getting, they're redrawing my district, they're drawing me out of my district, they're blah, blah, blah. That person normally then focuses on their next race, and it might make it, from a public relations standpoint, a little easier to make one of those districts red or purple versus the blue seats. I mean, I think Stephanie Murphy's is a purple seat today, if with the right candidate. But, if you have issues like primaries, in purple districts, regardless of whether you're Republican or Democrat, if your party has a primary and your opponent does not, you're not likely to win. And that goes for statewide races as well. If for instance, if Marco does not have a primary and Stephanie Murphy does, it really gives Marco a better chance of holding on to that Republican seat. However, if Marco gets primaried by a legitimate candidate with millions of dollars and Stephanie Murphy is not, it really gives a leg up to Stephanie Murphy winning that seat because Florida holds its primaries so close to the general election. You might as well call it Labor Day. And you have, less than 100 days from the primary election to regroup Republicans behind a top-tier candidate like that. And, Nikki Fried, both Alex Sink and Nikki Fried won their initial races in that scenario. Alex Sink did not have a primary. Republicans did. Alex Sink won. Nikki Fried did not have a primary. Republicans did, and Nikki Fried won. And so, we have to be really careful about who and when we primary, especially in purple seats. If you're talking about red seats, then it's probably a different equation. If you're talking about a Naples seat where it's like, okay, the Republican primary is likely going to be the winner regardless. That's a different conversation than, a Stephanie Murphy seat. We don't win a Stephanie Murphy seat if we have a primary.
So wait a minute. Let's make sure we're clear. Let's say Stephanie Murphy runs for Senate, for our argument's sake. Okay. Wouldn't that be a positive for the conservative candidates running in that district? Let's say she runs against Rubio. Whether or not she beats Rubio, let's leave that out for the moment. Wouldn't that be a positive for us?
Yeah, let's take redistricting out of it for a moment. In Stephanie Murphy's seat as it sits today, if Stephanie Murphy were to vacate that seat for whatever reason, and Democrats pick a candidate who does not have a primary and Republicans have a primary, I would bet that the Democrat would win that seat.
Okay.
Regardless of who the Republican is.
Right. Well, then, okay. So that's a question of internal politics of whether you can herd the cats and not flood the box with too many conservatives, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And certainly everybody is going to be watching their own district, and I would assume, Jamie, that the current elected officials are saying, "Wait a minute, you're taking my purple seat and making it really blue, or red is turning purple." There's going to be a lot of watchful eyes, I would say, on each of their own districts for the incumbents.
There are. I don't know that anyone has yet, but in the past, members of Congress have hired lobbyists who registered and to watch their backs in Tallahassee to ensure that their districts are. I would expect that type of effort to happen again, whether they're paid or unpaid. Kind of lobbying efforts that happen to watch people's back and make sure that if I'm Vern Buchanan, for instance, he's in a pinkish seat. It's not deep red, and he won that seat the first time by 300 votes in the general election.
Wow.
But again, he had a primary and the Democrat did not. So I put some of that up to that. He hasn't had a primary since. But if that seat were to move north and and we have a primary, that could spell trouble if the Democrats do not.
Right.
So let's go back to Rubio for a minute, because I want to kind of wrap up on the Rubio discussion and then we'll kind of go on to bigger things. So look, the pundits nationally, Jamie, are saying that Rubio is vulnerable. He's listed as one of the top 10 senatorial seats to flip in 2022. It doesn't mean it's going to be not flip, but at risk. Okay, so he could lose technically to another conservative. He could lose the seat to theoretically a liberal. Florida, as you know, is can kind of go which way the wind blows. What's your take on Rubio? Is he going? He's going to clearly have a solid Democratic challenger. We just don't know who it is. What's your position today? I'm not asking you to predict it, but if you had to kind of call the lay of the land, what do you see?
I don't think there's any doubt that Rubio wins a primary. I do believe that he is. There could be a caveat to that if somebody farther from the right from Miami decided to primary him, that could maybe cause him a problem in a primary. But I don't believe that will happen. And so my prediction is that Rubio would win a primary for sure.
Okay.
But go back to my original statement. Florida is a purple state, regardless of the 3-point win that Donald Trump had, which is basically a landslide. in Florida.
Yes.
You know, purple, statewide we're purple. If Rubio has a primary and the Democrats do not, we are very likely to lose that seat. And so, and Rubio's not going to lose the primary. You can go back and look at, anybody who's thinking about running against Rubio, I'd say go look at Mel Martinez's primary versus Bill McCollum back in 2004. And I think you would see that those types of numbers. I mean, Bill McCollum won, I think it was 61 of 67 counties.
So
Lost the primary to Mel Martinez because he was able to build so much margin in Miami-Dade.
So let's assume nobody primaries Rubio just because he's got kind of his little machine in Florida. Then let's talk about what my real question was really, okay, Rubio head to head with a Democratic challenger in the state of Florida, and that's really what's on the table is that and nationally Rubio is targeted as a weak seat, okay, for lack of better terms. So in that particular case, I mean, is it just flip a coin because Florida could go either way, really, Rubio really doesn't have a base. What's your take?
The problem for Democrats is that they don't have a candidate who's known statewide, and Rubio has won statewide, I think, twice now. Mm-hmm. And so, there is now you could say that name ID could be used against him or whatever, but it is very expensive to play in Florida. If you're sitting and you're the chairman of the Democrat Senate Committee, I've done this both in Florida and North Carolina, where you have campaigns have budgets; they're not limitless. And as much as people hear these numbers and think, "Oh, wow, there's unlimited money," there is not. And so, if you're chairman of the Democrat Senate U.S. Senate Committee, and you're like, "Okay, I can spend $50 to $100 million, have a chance at beating Marco Rubio with Ron DeSantis at the top of the ticket," and some of it is dependent upon the popularity of both men at that point in time. But if Ron DeSantis remains nearly as popular as he is now, Marco Rubio cannot be beat with $50 to $100 million by Democrats. And so a Democrat, somebody who's in charge of that budget, is going to be like, you know what, we can go to North Carolina where there's an open seat and probably spend $22 million, and we'll have $78 million left to go play in other states if we decide not to try to take out Marco Rubio. So I think at the end of the day, Marco wins because Florida is just such an expensive state for a challenger to become known statewide.
Irrespective of his politics, whether he's really toeing the conservative line, could I give it the analogy, Casey and Jamie, of the Trump, the Trump bandwave, in other words, but, just put DeSantis in the seat and say he rides DeSantis's coattails, for lack of better terms?
No, I don't think so, because I think it's a match made in heaven, DeSantis and Rubio being at the top of the ticket, because I think DeSantis benefits from Marco being from Miami and his popularity there, and Marco will benefit from DeSantis's popularity with Trump voters. So if Republicans were to have two people at the top of the ticket who are running, I don't think there's a match better than DeSantis and Rubio. They're two totally different folks, but in some ways they really can have the opportunity to really work with one another and to get both across the line. And both of them have their eyes on 2024. And if both of them can focus on 2022 and say, hey, listen, 2024 will fall where it does, they're both going to be successful in 2022.
And I don't see the Democratic Party having just a single challenger. There will be a primary. I can't imagine they'll be organized enough to bring up one candidate to oppose Rubio. So going on what you had said earlier, if Rubio doesn't have an opponent, that's going to really benefit him even more in that race.
If they have a primary, it becomes really hard unless Rubio has a primary as well. And that's kind of the DeSantis model, right?
Right.
DeSantis had a primary, Gillum had a primary, and you ended up with this 30,000 vote race.
That was too close.
So,
too tight, yeah.
That was a frightening close race, so thankful it turned out the way it did.
Yeah.
Well, on DeSantis, can we talk about Casey? Maybe
Yeah, let me comment real quick,
Yeah,
if you don't
yeah,
mind,
please,
KW.
yeah.
Betty has just commented about the Rubio conversation. She said Rubio just needs correction and new guidance from the GOP. He sits on the fence sometimes, just needs to understand no more fence sitting, needs to take conservative stand or get out of the Republican Party. He's okay.
Okay.
And Richard Kenny says, I want Trump back in the White House. That may happen in 2024. Let's talk about that a little bit. Do you think there's a possibility, Jamie, that Trump will run again?
I think it's certainly a possibility. My guess is that he doesn't, but it would only be a guess. I mean, I think that he is behind the scenes doing things to prepare for that, for sure. So he's doing, I think, the things behind the scenes that will make him available to do that. It's just a matter of whether he pulls the trigger. I think he's going to wait and see how 2022 plays out. And, you know, if Mr. Trump, President Trump starts moving his residency to New York, you can count on Ron DeSantis being his VP nominee.
That would be quite a ticket. Very exciting for Florida if that were to happen. So we're definitely watching Trump. He's just starting to come out and make comments now. I don't blame him for taking a step back and getting out of the public eye for a few months. And I think we're going to be hearing a lot more from Trump in the coming months.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. You know,
I
the
don't
old
think
saying.
there's any question about it.
Yeah, I think so. The old saying of, you know, better to be the kingmaker sometimes, you know, than try to be the king. And I think that's where he's, you know, playing chess, not checkers. Going into 2022, I would imagine. Would you agree, Jamie, or, you know, what are you thinking?
I agree. I mean, you know, I think we as party activists, you know, have to be careful of just saying, oh, that's a Trump candidate, that's the person that we have to push, because I think we have to be a little bit more strategic in some of these, depending on the district. Like, I just think that there's some districts that, you know, far-right conservatives are, let's get them. Let's get as many as we can. You know,
Okay.
There's some districts where that person's not going to win the general election. And so we have to be realistic about that and keep our eyes on the prize, that the prize in 2024 is the presidency and the prize in 2022 is Congress, the House. And so to do that, we have to split, you know, 10 seats or whatever it is. And so we need to make sure that we're strategic about that.
Well, let's talk about. I mean, let's wrap up on Ron DeSantis for a minute, because look, I mean, let's be clear. Ron DeSantis is not going to just walk into the governorship without a challenge from the Democrats, and obviously, Nikki Fried has been touted as a potential challenger.
That's right.
You know, I don't really know, you know, what the Democratic Party, frankly, thinks what their platform is going to be. But you know, let's be clear. I mean, we're in a Biden administration. We're in a leftist liberal movement, socialist movement. It's powerful. It's strong. We can't underestimate that. What does the governor race look like, Jamie? That's really something that people, I think, want to hear about.
I think, you know, when you start looking at the governor's race, I think as of today, there is zero chance Ron DeSantis faces a primary, a legitimate primary, where I'd put Rubio at 15%, right? A legitimate, well-funded primary.
Okay.
But there's zero chance Ron DeSantis faces a primary. And there's probably a 70 or 80% chance Nikki Fried faces a primary on the Democratic side, which, number one, she's never had.
Right.
She's never had a primary. So, you know, how's she going to be able to handle that? How does, you know, she kind of was the beneficiary of just like, hey, I'll run for ag commissioner. And, you know, the Republicans beat themselves up to a point where they lost a very, very close race that they should have won. I think by fewer than 5,000 votes she won. So she's not an 800-pound gorilla on the Democratic side. And I know that she's so much of not an 800-pound gorilla that if she runs for governor, she's running because she doesn't believe she can win re-election to her own seat against Wilton Simpson, who is an actual farmer. And Senate president right now. So I just, you know, that you start looking at where does Nikki Fried go? Does she try to hold on to her own seat? Or does she say, okay, if I'm going to fail, I might as well fail going for the bigger seat and try to raise money and have a bigger platform? And neither one of those options are really good for her.
You've been up in Tallahassee. Have you heard through the rumor mill any other the candidates on the Democratic side that appear to be a strong challenger?
You can throw in the Val Demings, the Stephanie Murphy, which everybody thinks kind of are geared a little bit more towards U.S. Senate. Charlie Crist, for sure, is kicking the tires on governor. I don't think he has the appetite to go against Marco Rubio again, if that tells you anything about Marco Rubio's strengths. Those are kind of the names that are being thrown around. Every once in a while, you'll hear Buddy Dyer or, the Tampa mayor name escapes me right now. The former police chief. But anyway, you have a cast of characters, but none of them are known statewide. They're known in their corner of the world, and those coming out of Orlando or St. Pete might have a little bit more of and Nikki Fried is from St. Pete. So it'd be interesting to see a Charlie Crist, Nikki Fried primary for sure.
Charlie Crist is, he's been in every party, so I think that's hurt him, no matter what he decides to do. But he's probably the most well-known out of the cast of characters you've just stated.
He's only won 2 statewide races, so
right.
Well, look, here's the thing, Jamie.
He'd be the one I think would be the strongest candidate on the Democrat side for either one of those seats. But the fact that he's choosing DeSantis over Rubio tells you Rubio's strength.
Right.
Well, the question, look, here's the point I want to make, and this is where, I continue to go back to, and Casey and I talk about this all the time, and Jamie, I've had this conversation. Like the last governor election, irrespective of the fact that both, DeSantis and Gillum, went to war, in the party and then, had to come out and fight each other, 30,000 votes is still, razor thin, okay? 30, 50, 100,000 votes in a state like Florida is still a razor thin, win in my book. And I just can't, I think we have to be very cautious because the reality is, even if the candidate is lesser, okay, on the Democratic side than a Ron DeSantis, per se, it has not, look at the Biden, and I'm going to pull the fraud out of it for a minute, okay? Look at what happened. We cannot discount, in my opinion, what potentially could happen to the state of Florida in a governor's race. And I want people to recognize that.
100%. We have to be prepared. I think the worst talking point that came out of the 2020 election is that Florida's a red state. It is not.
It's not. No.
It is just not. You can go back to, I think it's 1992, and if you take every top of the ticket, there's been more than 60 or 70 million votes cast. It's probably about 70 million. You had all the Democrats' votes, all the Republican votes, and they're separated by about 150,000 votes. This is long-term purple state. Right,
and that's the problem, right? Okay, and then we look at the growth. We got growth counties, but then we look at the anchor, Dade County, Broward County, Palm Beach County, and frankly, it's trying to get into Martin County. It's already infiltrated St. Lucie County. It's just the blue anchor, and the blue anchor is powerful, and the fact that you can't get anybody elected down south in the conservative movement, i.e. To Congress or any meaningful position, it's evidence that this is not something that's going to be an easy ride here, Jamie.
Yeah, I think in areas like that, the messages in conservatism, it's reasonable. It's common sense. It's, right now, Democrats are not doing either one of those things. They're not being reasonable, and they're not applying common sense to any of these things, whether it's COVID or whether taxes, the border security. So, my recommendation for anybody who's thinking about running for office, especially in Southeast Florida, is to be the reasonable Republican with common sense.
Jamie, I have a question on Facebook for you. Mr. Miller, sir, with everything that gets slipped into bills being passed, why hasn't anyone slipped term limits in yet? Just curious. That's from Richard.
Okay, so that's at the federal level. Florida has term limits at both the state house and Senate. What people don't realize is that we also pass term limits for our members of Congress. And a court ruled that cannot apply until a majority of states also have term limits, because it found that by limiting our members of Congress, because the U.S. House and Senate are based on the seniority system, that Florida would be at a major disadvantage if we applied federal term limits to our members of Congress alone. So, which I tend to agree with. I'm not a believer. I was a proponent of term limits when I first began my career in politics, or prior to my career when I was an activist. And throughout my career, I've realized that I don't think that is the solution to the perceived problem. In Florida, for instance, you have term limits on our state house and state senate, and you have in the Senate you have people with more than 8 years of experience, but literally you have people who have not served in the state house yet, who before they've taken a single vote have already been determined by their class that they're going to be Speaker of the House.
Yeah.
And which is probably the second or third most powerful position in the state of Florida. And so, you won an election and now you're in line to be Speaker of the House, and lobbyists and everyone else start treating you like that in Tallahassee. And from the day you show up in Tallahassee, you're in the top 10 of most powerful politicians in the state without ever having voted on anything. Or, so I really struggle with that issue, because I believe that, it's wrong to have a Nancy Pelosi in there for 30 or 40 years. But I also think that there is a valid argument for at least Nancy Pelosi has been elected. The people who are controlling the levers of government should be the elected officials.
Right,
and
but okay.
And sometimes with term limits, it seems like that may turn out not to be the case.
But let's throw something on the table just for meat on the bone, right? Is a three-term proposal reasonable? I mean, I think it is. I think that gives you enough time to represent the people. You're elected, and then you basically refresh the branches of liberty, right? You bring in somebody new who then can go on and carry on the torch. What do you know?
I am in violent agreement with you in theory. And the problem is that it is a theory, and I don't think the practical application is what works. You're assuming that the elected officials are controlling the government. And so what happens is you have staff members who outlive the elected officials, and so
That's a great point.
They sit there and say, they get an elected official who really wants to change things. They literally just put the brakes on everything. You see this at the county level where there are term limits. The staff just doesn't want to, or a city where there's term limits. The staff just says, I'm just going to wait the elected officials out, and they do. And so the staff ends up being the more powerful decision maker in our government. That should not be the case. Well, that is what happens with term limits.
Go ahead, yeah.
And so I've come to the conclusion that term limits is not the answer for people serving too long in office. If you want to talk about how we fund campaigns and fund incumbents, and change incumbent protection type laws and things like that, that's probably a show in of itself. But that's the issue, not term limits, because term limits creates a separate problem that just takes the problem out of the public's view, and it's not a solution at all. It actually makes the problem much, much worse.
Well, you really brought up some good points I hadn't thought about with term limits, because I'm definitely a proponent of term limits as well. I think you touched on it. We're not going to go into it because we're at the end of our hour, but an incumbent has a tremendous advantage over any newcomer, and that is with the fundraising. And I'll step back a little bit. You were talking about, that the newly elected legislators are already pegged to be Speaker of the House, the Senate President, what have you, before they even start voting. And a lot of that comes about money, right? I mean, they look at the big fundraisers around the state. Who really is able to bring a lot of attention and money to the party?
Yeah, some of it's that. Some of it's personalities. Some of it's most of it is probably a combination of the two. I mean, a lot of it's luck of the draw. If what happens in some cases is because in Florida, let's say you fill a vacancy for a state house seat. Someone's vacated the seat for whatever reason, and I run for that seat. Well, that first run doesn't count towards my term limits. So I get to run as an incumbent on my first term, which, let's say nobody runs against me. That then gives me the ability to go run around the state and help others raise money. And I basically become speaker because I have a one session, maybe a one session advantage over my colleagues in the same quote class. And while they're running for the election of their lives to get into the House, I'm already there, and it just basically becomes a timing issue. It's maybe not the best person; it's just timing. And so I just don't know that that's the best way to decide.
It is. It's very, very interesting, and I'm sure there are better ways to decide, and that would be something that would need to go through the legislature to be approved. Am I right about that? If you were to change the process.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
A couple other comments. I just see career politicians becoming millionaires. I find it very disturbing that that's what happens as career politicians. And no term limits does nothing but build and add muck to the mire. Bad attracts bad. It's common sense. So, there's a lot of aspects to term limits, and they are what they are. I personally found it very interesting that Florida had tried to pass something for our congressional seats, and I can understand why that was overturned.
Yeah, I think that literally, if you research it, I think it passed in 94 or 96.
Okay.
It passed in the 90s. Whenever the state House and Senate went into term limits, that's when we passed also for the congressional.
Okay.
And as far as I know, that's still an active law. If enough other states were to pass it, that we would then put limits on our members of Congress.
It would have to be a national effort.
There would have to be other states that decide to impose term limits on their members of Congress.
Absolutely. Well, KW, I think we're nearing the end of our hour, and Jaime Miller, it has been such a pleasure to speak with you. You've been very insightful, and really appreciate your input. And you can find Jaime at peoplewhothink.com. Listen to the beginning of the show, you'll find out that his agency has a lot of tentacles and can help you in a lot of different areas, especially advertising and getting a name out there.
Well, and Jaime, I think, the fact that you're over in Sarasota, the chairman of the Florida GOP, Joe Gruters, is in your neighborhood. He's also a Florida state senator.
Yes.
We're clearly going to want to, reach back out to you. I know Joe is on our to-do list. We want to get Joe at some point to come in and talk to us about, where the party's going and other aspects. Because, we're at the beginning phases of a really long fight going into 2022. To not only hold the line in Florida, but hold the line across the board in the United States. In Florida, we've got to base, Florida, this is not Ohio. No offense to our friends in Ohio. We've got to hold the line in Florida, and I think we have such a critical position that folks like yourself and Joe and others are going to be really important to helping us define how we do that.
Absolutely. And Eric Miller, one more comment here, just we'll finish up the show. He's from Talk About Martin. He said the Republican Party of Florida is a big problem. They support cronies over grassroots and meddle in the primaries. So another whole topic to cover.
That certainly is. I would just end with, we can't assume that these 2 new seats are Republican if we decide to go out and primary everybody. Because if we put every chess piece on the board and decide to play them all, we're going to end up losing more than just those 2 seats.
It's a very good point. Thank you so much, Jaime Miller. Something we've really got to keep our eye on, as KW said so well, and you as well, Jaime. We're a purple state, and it's going to be important to watch how this redistricting plays out and how it changes the current districts. So see where they're at. It'll be fun to follow. And Jaime, I do hope you come back and we'll talk a little bit more. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Again, Jaime Miller from People Who Think, and you can visit his website, peoplewhothink.com.
Thanks, Jaime.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all. And next week we'll be back Thursday at 10 a.m. We try to keep to an hour, but there's just so much to talk about. It's hard to do, but a lot of fun. And if you have some topics you want to cover, drop us a line. Add it in the comments, and we'll definitely consider that. And Eric Miller, if you side with Joe, you are toast. You got it, Eric.
All right. We got all the Millers on the line today.
Yeah, we got a lot of Millers. It's Miller time today.
Absolutely. All right. Conservative Millers, of course.
That's
okay.
right. So Casey and KW will be back next Thursday, 10 a.m. Thanks for joining us.
All right. Thank you.